Okay, so I went through some of your homework and I pulled out some problems that I thought looked good, and let's go over some of them. As you can see, I implemented the tagging if you are interested. We can show you where I put that. I went to File Manager, went up a directory to the course.conf file, and edited that, and added that line somewhere near the bottom. Here it is. Permission levels to modify tags go to the professor. Okay, that diversion aside, let's go back to where we were. Okay, so this problem I really liked. I think you could have maybe used a little bit more of the PGML features here. So for instance, you're making a list, but you're not taking advantage of the automatic list features available to you in PGML. And maybe you want to think about indenting these items that have the answer blanks to make it easier to read. So for instance, if we were to edit the source, we could go in and just change these to ordinary PGML list type. And then also to indent, put 4 spaces. And now you can see the formatting is a bit clearer. It's clear that this is now, just from visual inspection, it's clear this is a problem with 4 parts. It's easy to find the answer blanks. I really liked that you included this answer format help, which I'm going to talk about in more detail today. Again, looking at the source, yeah, everything looks good. You realized you could create a math object for the formula for this vector valued function f, and you could just apply the derivative operator directly to it. That was great. You used reduce. As far as answers go, typically I've gotten in the habit of calling my answers things like answer 1, answer 2, answer 3, just because I find that when I'm writing a lot of problems, it just helps me keep track of things to have them organized that way. I would like to invite you all to speak up and ask questions at any time during this presentation. This is a very loosely scripted part of the workshop, and I want discussion to happen.
Okay, I got a question for you, Paul. About the spacing, when you change those letters, A, B, C, D, did you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I thought that when you broke and put a space in there, that broke the pattern, and then they all reverted back to A. Or if I tried it with the number 1, 2, 3, it would revert back to number 1, number 1, number 1. It wouldn't keep the automatic formatting once you put a blank vertical space between those problems. And I'm surprised it didn't do it.
Let's experiment. Let's see what happens if we remove those first 4 spaces from that answer blank. View the changes. And now you can see exactly the behavior you're talking about. So if you don't indent it, then the PGML starts a new list. But if you do indent, then it realizes it's all part of the same list.
I got it. Thank you.
Paul, before you pass that up, could I make one comment?
Yeah.
This is just a stylistic issue. You're asking to compute f primed and then delta g or nabla g. It might be, I might have switched b and c. So you compute the derivative, and then evaluate it. And compute the derivative and evaluate it. It's kind of mixed up in my order. But that's, certainly nothing wrong with the coding.
Right, and in fact, I believe there's another example, problem 11 on this homework set, where a student participant actually did that. sort of arrangement of the questions. Another one from the same person, and this one was also very good. As far as looking at the typesetting, everything looks great. If we look at the randomization looks great. You might want to think about having some of these random values start at something other than 1 to guarantee that you're not, for instance, going to get a coefficient of 1 out in front here. So maybe you want to change k to be 2 or 3, something like that. Those are some randomization issues that typically come up. And looks like you found the right macro, the polynomial factors macro, which you can pair together with the limited powers, which is one of my favorite names for a macro. It's got limited powers. You can pair those two things together to require students to factor their answers and also to restrict the degree of their answer. And this, I hope, was taken right from the WeBWorK wiki, where it's been documented and implemented. And I think everything here just looks really, really clean and really good. Okay, I got a bit off.
I just wanted to mention one thing about the factored form. It doesn't require you to factor the k out. So even though you may, there's nothing in that one that requires you to pull the constant out. Just for people using that so that they're aware of that limitation too.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing today.
So David, what is the state of the art on these macros? Because when I wrote this wiki documentation page probably 4 or 5 years ago, this was sort of state of the art. Are there now macros that can require students to factor the k out?
No, there isn't. I mean, if you would have, that was one of the issues, for example, is if you had something, say, with where b was negative, you could factor a -1 out of that and have it. It's, you know, if you're trying to force order and those kinds of things. So there are some issues about what actually should be done for these. So currently, the constant isn't, a constant factor isn't taken into account. I mean, you know, there's nothing that forces the constant to be removed. You could, in fact, the correct answer for this one, in my case, didn't show it factored that way. It had 2x plus 2 in it. So there's nothing that actually checks that at the moment. If you wanted to, you could make a custom checker that would look at the format of the answer the student produced and see if there is a constant multiple, but that's much more sophisticated.
Yeah, and generally, I would say most of us would be happy if students would factor it in this form without even worrying about factoring out an extra k.
Right. I just wanted to point out that that is not being enforced. If people wanted to write problems of this kind, that's an issue that you wouldn't do. I mean, if you multiplied through by a negative, for example, it's not going to require you to pull that out.
Problem 3, very similar to problem 1, and very similar in formatting and style. This person correctly identified the indentation. Just a matter of style. I typically use ABC for the parts of the problem rather than 1, 2, 3, just because when a student is asking me a question about homework problem number 1, part A just seems more natural than homework problem 1, part 1 does. So that's a minor, very minor thing. If we look at the code, at the source code, yeah, things look good. You thought about the domain of the function involved, which is a good thing. You even differentiated, got the string result, and reduced it further, which is I suppose a good thing to do in this case. It might have been overkill, but that's okay, I guess, as long as you checked it and it works. It would have been nice if you had randomized these values, 7 and 2 and so forth. And in general, one of the issues with copyright is, are you making a verbatim copy or not? And if your problem has randomization in it, and it's a generic problem, you can essentially say that copyright does not apply because A, it's a generic problem, and B, it's not an identical copy of a textbook problem if it has randomization in it. But in general, of course, working with publishers is a good thing to do. Asking them for permission before you start a project is a good thing to do. I believe that if you find yourself in the unfortunate position that you've written a bunch of problems that do fall under copyright, I believe you are allowed to use those problems with your student because you wrote those WeBWorK problems, but you would not be able to share those problems with other instructors or with the world via the Open Problem Library. Okay, and this student is looking at the factoring problem in a totally different way. So I thought I would include this example for that reason. So I think it's clear from the format that this professor has chosen to write this question in that they might be working with students at a lower level, like high school students or something like that, right? I mean, it's asking for identify the coefficients, which is a very sort of basic question. Identify the greatest common factor. And then, of course, you realize that the professor has, in some ways, given away the answer down here, and we will look at scaffolding later on in this workshop today that will help us deal with issues like that. So a number of things that could be done to improve the readability of this question would be things like including different parts, part A, part B, part C, and so forth. Okay, and you'll notice that there must have been, in this problem source, there must have been a return and a couple of spaces or something like that, causing this unfortunate formatting here. And it maybe didn't get enough spaces to indent this here. But I could go back and fix that to alleviate this problem with the A popping up last. And of course, dealing with issues like this that I now introduced would be important to do. In general, putting thought into how your problem is displayed and how and what you actually write to the students is a very important thing. So poorly displayed problems are going to take the students longer to understand and make the problem a bit more frustrating than it needs to be, which is, of course, something you want to avoid, right? You want them to be frustrated on things that actually matter, like trying to understand the mathematics, not with trying to understand the formatting of the question. And again, as far as communicating clearly with the students, I would say that this last part here could be worded more. It could just use an improvement in the wording, right? You're now asked to complete this problem. Well, why not give the student a directive? So something like factor the trinomial given here and repeat the trinomial down in Part B here. So really focusing in on communicating clearly with students is important too. So if we get rid of that extra space there, get a hard return, make sure we got 4 spaces indents, a lot of hard return there. So we're going to a couple blank spaces at the end. Make sure we got blank spaces at the end. Hopefully that improves the formatting. Okay, so still have a few formatting issues to deal with in this question, but you get the idea.
When you change the space in there at the end, it seemed like the parts got renumbered to AAAB.
Yep.
I'm having a trouble with that too.
Maybe I should have included extra hard returns here, like in the previous, or the first example we looked at today. Oh, that didn't fix it either. One nice thing about PGML is that it makes it easier to type these sorts of questions, but it also relies on things like hidden characters, right? So these 2 spaces that I have highlighted right here, I maybe don't want those.
I think you want those, but it may well be the bug in PGML. There are some interactions between paragraphing and lists and things that may not be right, and so that could be one of them.
Okay, well that seemed to fix the A-B problem that we were having. Anything else that we want to talk about on this one?
Sorry, what did you do to fix the AB problem?
So to fix the A-B problem, I went through the end of these lines and I made sure that there were no spaces at the end. So for instance, if I hold down the Shift key and press the arrow key, I can see the spaces, and you see how it jumped there? That tells me that there was the new line. And I can remove those spaces then by hitting delete. And it looks like I had a couple spaces there, a couple spaces there, and a couple spaces there, and a hard return without any spaces. So basically 2 spaces here, 2 spaces here, 2 spaces here, no spaces and hard return there, and that fixed the issue. Okay, and as an R enthusiast, I got to say I loved this homework question. One of the things that jumped out at me right away, though, is that this is in a different font than this is. And maybe that's just me, because I'm sensitive to these things, but it jumped out at me right away. So other than that, things on the surface of it look to be very good in this question. So let's go ahead and take a look at the source. And, oh, here, this one does not have the colon. So it needs the colon there to get the same font as the other parts.
You also need the spaces, so the colon and 3 spaces are...
Okay. There we go. And now, that was the second for loop, and yes, everything is typeset in this, I presume, Courier or some monospace font. Now, okay, and this question is actually interesting for another reason. When you're writing WeBWorK questions, you have to be aware that you're delivering things in 2 different modes, HTML mode and PDF hard copy mode. So, how many of you actually checked that your PDF hard copy mode was actually working? My guess is probably nobody did. Let's actually go back to this homework set and download the PDF hard copy. Okay, so if everything is good, the PDF hard copy will pop up, and it turns out not everything is good. Okay, so it tells us that there is an extra curly brace or a forgotten end group. Well, where is that coming from? Well, as an instructor, you get the, so the student would be delivered the PDF file. So technically this would compile for the student and they'd get something. It would just end up being incomplete. And in particular, if we look at this hard copy that the student would get delivered, we would notice that in parts B and C here, there is definitely something missing, and it's curly braces are missing there. If we go back, we could also see that in the text source file, if we wanted to, right, we get the actual line number for the line at which the error occurred, line 754 of this hardcopy.tech. I'm going to paste that into Notepad editor so that I can get line numbers. Yeah, do not update anything. 754 was the line number I wanted. If I wanted to track down this error, it's going to take forever. 754. 754. Item missing brace. Well, if you know tech, you know that you can't have a lone brace like that. That's a special character in tech. You can see that 754, line 754 is part of this WeBWorK question that we've been talking about with the R code. So that'll help us debug it. And let's go back to the problem source. Where is it? Okay, so here's the problem. If we click the edit button, we'll get the problem source. And so how can we fix that problem? So ordinarily, you could type these curly braces inside PGML. However, since we're constructing this using a multiple choice object outside of PGML, this curly brace is not going to be interpreted by PGML first thing as a raw string. And that's what's causing the error. So one thing we could do to prevent that error would be to use actually some of the special codes that we have for these special characters. And so the PG basic macros file, which has been around since the advent of WeBWorK, I'm sure, provides commands like lbrace and rbrace for typesetting things successfully in both HTML and tech mode. So going back to that, we could replace this by rbrace. We could replace this by lbrace. And let's actually view the results. Oh, it prints a literal rbrace. Okay, so it looks like it's printing the raw tech code instead of the symbol. So I think what we should do is go back and make sure that this is typeset in math mode. And since we're outside of PGML, math mode is standard LaTeX syntax for math mode. Take action. There we go. Now we're getting the proper braces. And maybe we wanted to typeset these other parentheses in math mode just to balance things out. Okay, and if we were to save those changes using update and save changes, take action. Oh, changes in this file have not yet permanently been saved. Okay, so maybe I would need to save it as a new version or something. If I were to save the changes and reload the homework set and generate a PDF hard copy, I would expect that the PDF hard copy would no longer have any errors. Okay, any questions on this one, or should we move on?
In that one you just did, would it have worked to put in the way that you would normally put a left brace and right brace in LaTeX, like with the backslash and then left and then the brace?
Yes. So I could have done R brace and L brace, which, since they're inside of the LaTeX mode delimiters, we're going to always have that be interpreted in tech mode.
And what page do you go to access that code?
So those special characters, the way to escape them, are provided by the PG basic macros,
Okay.
which, as their name implies, were written a long time ago. And that doesn't mean they're not still used, but so, for instance, when you look at the wiki pages, you'll see a lot of these special display constants show up. Right, you'll see a lot of B bold, E bold, B italic, E italic in those pages. I would say, don't use these old constants, $PI and $E. There are better ways to do it. Just put it inside a math object and call it lowercase pi or lowercase e.
Okay.
Paul, you were concerned about the font earlier on. Are you concerned about the math mode font for this?
Well, slightly, but I would say that this is a workaround that is acceptable to me. If I were really fussy, I would create my own mode-specific variable. So how about my lbrace could be a mode-specific variable that in HTML is not going to have any problems being rendered as an lbrace, but in tech mode, maybe we want to do something like this, do quotes and quotes. Okay, so then if I were to define this command up above, oops, I could use it below. I guess I'm using lbrace. And let's view the changes. Undefined. Oh, modes. Plural. Oh, and now it's disappeared from the HTML output. Oh, it's my. Thanks. There are some things you shouldn't do in public, and programming is probably one of them. Okay, and then it appears correctly in HTML, and I would presume as well in tech. Okay, so we got a few more minutes. I liked this graph problem. Again, I would suggest that you put questions near the top of the page instead of the bottom of the page. Make the answer blanks really easy to find. That'll really help students and keep their frustration level low. So I would have put the graph below the text. If we look at the problem source for this one, things look good. You might want to think about the randomization a bit as well. So, for instance, doing things like you did, avoiding the possible zero parameters is a good thing to do. And I'd like to point out that David Cervone mentioned that we could do things like split up the labels list if we wanted to exclude 0 from the labels from -10 to 10, we could have it generate a list from -10 to -1, and then append a list from 1 to 10. And that would work as well. When making these these dynamically generated graphs, I highly suggest that you refresh cached images so that you're always getting a fresh image displayed and not getting a stale image. And as you can see, our changes got rid of the zeros around the crossing of the axes. Okay, with this one, I really liked it, except perhaps the formatting. Right, you probably want to put this on a separate line, like we did with problem 1 today, and the same here. This one I also liked a lot. The only suggestion for improvement I saw would be maybe put more space in between your list items. So putting another hard return here in your source code between the end of the answer blank and part B. Okay, and this one jumped out at me because I saw right away these were not the L angle and R angle characters that I'm used to seeing in textbooks and things. If we take a look at the source, let's look at the PGML. Okay, so this person is printing the literal typeset string here, and what maybe would have been better would be to use math objects to your advantage. So for instance, what is the math object that should go there? Oh, well, there's some room for improvement here, right? We could define something $f to be given by this formula, and then take that object and compute its derivative. So in general, using your math objects wisely is going to save you time and energy. Right? You don't have to manually type out what $f is here because it's already defined as a math object above. And the beauty of math objects is that they have all these methods defined on them. You can do things like take derivatives. You can reduce their formulas. You can run an answer comparison method on them. The list goes on. And so use them to your advantage. They will save you a lot of time and energy in the long run if you learn to use them well. Okay, here's a good question. I liked the use of spacing in it. I would suggest if you've got 3 parts, name them A, B, C. The third part here is, again, you got to read your questions very carefully. Consider the following intervals based on the critical points. Determine if the interval is increasing or decreasing. Well, okay, is the interval really increasing or decreasing, or is the function defined on the interval what's really increasing or decreasing? So, yeah, writing these questions well is hard. You have to proofread very carefully. I think in a different randomization, I did get some funny output here that could have been cleared up using a reduce call, but I don't want to take everybody's time right now to do that. Okay, I've got a few more that I can go through. And this one I think is a very exemplary example. It typeset well, they group things well, meaning that f prime and f prime evaluated at a point are gathered together, and so on. I don't know if this sub P is standard notation. Maybe it is for your book, but that's, a stylistic choice. And this was just also another very good example of a WeBWorK question. One thing you might want to consider is how large the numbers get in your randomization. It's easy to over-randomize a problem. I would say choose a medium-sized bunch of random parameters. Right? You want everybody to have their own random parameters. So you might choose like randomization between 1 and 150. Well, that's overkill, right? If you do 1 to 10, then the probability that students have the same randomization is pretty low. And that's what we want. And it'll also help with the answer checking.